Over 18 months between 2007 and 2008, 21 young people died by suicide within a radius of 15 miles in Bridgend in South Wales. The public wanted justification. They wanted to know this localized epidemic will stop and get to the bottom of its cause. Today we'll discuss, was there ever any basis to distort the story of Bridgend suicides, with the primary take by the media of the deaths being attributed to a suicide cult. Detective Scott, I'm about to ruin your day. I'm about to shit all over your parade because the story we are diving in today is just one of the darkest things that I have researched. Like, my mental health this week has been in tatters. It was recommended by one of you, and although I appreciate you because I like diving into more morbid topics, please don't do this to me again. Please. I actually beg. Like, don't do this to me again. I really love the book that I have read for this case. The book coverage we'll mostly talk about in part 2. So this is going to be your next deep dive, right? In part 1, today, we are about to discuss the facts, the timeline of this case of Bridgend suicides, how they were discovered, how people honed in on, what was the media representation like, and was there ever any basis for calling it the internet suicide cult, for calling Bridgend the death town. And then in the second part, we will discuss that in more depth. It will be mostly analysis of samples of journalistic work because the book that is behind me has been done in such an academic research take because the book has been written by a professor, and she's a journalist as well, so basically she has covered it the way that I have once written a dissertation, in that type of way. So again, it is a bit of a different coverage when it comes to both part 1 and part 2, but today I believed the best way to approach this story and kind of reevaluate it all these years after is to cover it in such a way where you can see the story for what it is first, and then we can analyze everything that was wrong with how the story has been put out to the public. Hope that makes sense. Goes without saying, but if you are sensitive to the topic of suicides, of deaths by suicide, I would advise sit this one out, just take care of yourself, or take it in, I don't know, 10-minute intervals. That's what I do with like other morbid topics online where I'm intrigued, but I also cannot handle it all at once because we do deep dives here, and this is heavy. There's no other way to describe it. This is heavy. And from Anne herself, the book writer and the journalist, I have also been looking ever since I got recommended this topic, which was actually really early in the year, and I sort of started researching on it, and then was thinking, what is the ethical approach here? Because I don't want to do this story even more damage than has already been done. So from Anne, I have read the most ethical approach would be either to refer to the people in this story by initials, or even though she has covered 4 main stories in her book using their full names, to use just the first names. For the sake of storytelling, I will just be using the first names. I will not be mentioning anybody's last names. It's really not my intention to re-victimize anybody here again. I just want us to reevaluate this because I find it so bizarre that nobody had ever suffered any consequences with how Bridgend suicides were reported as a topic, as something that was present within Wales for so many months. That being said, let us dive into the story of the day. Before we actually dive into the story of the Bridgend suicides in 2007 and 2008, I have to really place you into Bridgend at that point and give you some context on the city and also on the suicides in the relation to the city. Because just like with Dunblane, just like with Hungerford, when you put Bridgend into a Google search, something sinister pops up. Dunblane and Hungerford are the places that were famous for their massacres. With Bridgend, it is this particular story. And once a place is synonymous with a tragedy, you have to start wondering, was it ever that bad to begin with? for something this sinister, this morbid to actually take place there. So Bridgend is a small place of around 150,000 people in between Cardiff and Swansea, about 20 miles from each place. What I found out throughout the book and through just basic Google searches and what you will hear about in part 2, it is a place that was famous for mining. So think working class. Think not poor, but not excessively rich, just average. You know, the place that has a couple of out-of-town shopping centers around it, some chain store, garages, industrial estates that you would find just anywhere else. When it comes to suicides, something that made my jaw drop, just purely on how bizarre it is, suicides were considered a crime until 1961. 1961. I thought I read that wrong. I had to double check on that information. Because what that means is that all the way up until 1961, if you were to commit suicide, die by suicide, sorry, that is another ethically right approach to it, not saying committing, because again, that is something that should have stayed in the past. Beyond 1961, committing means that there is some sort of crime involved. But let's say you were to die by suicide before then, your family or anybody succeeding you could still technically be brought to court and prosecuted for you dying by suicide. I don't know why, that just doesn't sit right with me. That's just something that's insane, just genuinely insane to me. Partially the reason behind this being seen as self-murder would be due to either religious or moral beliefs around you intentionally taking your own life. But then, between 1963 and 75, so after this law has been passed, there was a decrease in recorded suicides amongst both males and females in England and also in Wales. However, this decrease was quite short-lived, and ever since 1975 up until 1991, there was increase in amount of suicides that corresponded to male unemployment, violence, divorce, warrants for home repossessions, substance abuse, single-person households, abuse of alcohol and drugs, and the changing role of women throughout the British society. Now, with that spike, when the rate in suicide started increasing throughout 2007 and 2008, due to the narrow reporting by the tabloids and by the media, there was a link that would be made between suicides and the internet. That was forged, fabricated, whatever you want to call it, because that link had never truly been proven. And not just proven, but you would think that if it were proven, somebody would have to be held responsible for anything, for any sort of actions. If you are calling it a cult, who is the leader? Who is to suffer any consequences from this? Who is to be the person that we can hold responsible? And that just never happens. There has never been a person, a newspaper, publication, production company, nobody really held responsible for anything that happened in Bridgend. Now, truth to be told, rates of suicides in Wales, and particularly Bridgend borough, were never low. They were actually, on average, statistically higher than those both in England and Northern Ireland. The numbers of people who died by suicides remained constant between 1996 and 2006. There were about 300 people who died by suicides in Wales. And each year, on average, there was about 21.5 deaths per 100,000 people. And rates would differ, but they would always be higher among men compared to women. That rate has since dropped, so definitely it gives kind of the voice to all of the allegations that were made around Bridgend's suicides, if you think about it from that way. Because right now, the latest stats I could find were from 2017, and the rate is about 14.4 and then 14.7 deaths per every 100,000 people, you know, compared to 21.5. So what was it attributed to at the time, with that spike especially in 2007 and 2008? And this rate, so high at the time of this story and then low now, is usually attributed to the social climate in the area. So what you will hear throughout the story is, first things, as I mentioned already, that in Bridgend you have particularly an old working class region. And then the young people, the few of them, if you wish, that they are left there, that is kind of like the portrayal that you get. Not many young people are there by choice, and if they are, it is just to finish schooling, and maybe then they have aspirations, maybe they have some plans to get out of there. But because they all go to the one same school or one same college, depending on their age, if they have any lack of aspiration, it is as if it brushes against one another. So if one has it, you are to believe that the rest have it too. That is kind of like the feel that you will get from how this story was portrayed through the tabloids. Then you will particularly hear about the kids from the poorer backgrounds where the heavy drinking culture is present and the use of drugs, whichever drug of choice, whether it is cannabis, whether it is MDMA or Valium. And because we are separating fact from fiction here, some of these arguments would be backed up by statistics. They would factually be backed up by things like unemployment rate, things that we are going to discuss now. And I'm doing it in such a way so that once you actually hear how the stories have been reported in part 1, and especially when we are analyzing them detail by detail in part 2, then you can see, okay, maybe this wasn't true in every single case here. So in 2007, a UNICEF study of child well-being throughout Europe, basically in all of these different countries, ranked Britain last. The key measure in this study was the health of the society and how they take care of their children. The cover story was that the youth in Britain was unhappy, unloved, and out of control. That they were drinking, they were doing drugs, that they were becoming sexually active earlier and earlier, think like early teenage years, and they would be exhibiting more and more antisocial behavior than ever before. And this in particular was due to crime. So here again in the UK it kind of depends like per region. So again for Bridgend this was the crime at the time. Usually it is to do with stabbing and the rise in knife crime. What you would expect in that kind of social climate is then for parents naturally to socialize less and less with their kids, particularly in the sectors that were even poorer than others, in the marginalized ones, and that would then form some sort of dysfunctional social groups, meaning that the kids or young adults would be less integrated. So they would spend more and more time with the people that go to the same school or college with them. And if you add to the mix a class structure that then stops any social mobility and the education system that awards the rich, the advantaged, then some children are just going to be seen as other. They're just going to be left out and form their own social groups where they feel like they belong. And most commonly, if you can picture it, the social groups that you used to form as a child would be the people in the same social class. People who maybe wouldn't have the money to go after school, to have a drink, to go to Greg's, wherever the hell it was. You would usually become friends, unless you were social climbers, like so many people I went to school with the people that you belong with, which means usually people of the same social class. So that being said, the unemployment rate kind of, again, portrays a different story. So the unemployment rate in Bridgend, this is, I believe, like 2021, so recent ones. I couldn't really find them for the time that we are speaking about in this story. The unemployment rate is 3.9%. And the UK unemployment rate is 4.8%. So as a whole, you're not really packing up your suitcases and moving to Wales. However, then what this unemployment rate means, what the suicide levels mean before and after the story of the day, is that it's pretty average. It means that yes, it is probably prevalently working class. However, then down the road, you might see one of those nuclear families of no drinking issues, 2 parents, 2 children, a pet, and people living happily. However, in this story, that side was not portrayed at all. You will not hear that side portrayed at all. And people kind of wonder why. After you read story after story, there aren't really as many patterns in each story. Not every story sounds exactly the same for them all to be linked in such a way, in such a strong way as they have here. And what that leads to is othering, is making sure that this group, that this cluster of suicides has been seen as something else, something different, something that we should be afraid from, and that we should also try desperately to look for cause so it doesn't spread around, so it doesn't actually become an epidemic. And for you to understand how that is done, and to really show how each and every death was portrayed with an angle, we have to go back in time. So as I mentioned, the book analyzes in depth for suicides. So that is really what I am going to do, because the internet also has most information on those 4. So that brings us to one of the 4 suicides that the book focuses on. And this is when the media really started referring to the internet as the problem. And something that I didn't know before reading this story is that it wasn't the internet publications, it wasn't the tabloids that broke this story. It was actually Wales News Service. And that was followed by a press release by the suicide charity Papyrus. Now, after the release from the news agency, the papers picked up on the story. However, it really won't blow up, and the connection between the internet and the suicides won't be made until the 13th town suicide, the one of a girl named Natasha. From the initial reports, we find out that Natasha would be the town's 13th young suicide in less than a year, and she would be the first girl. She was described as pretty, sweet-eyed, 17-year-old girl whose picture was suddenly everywhere, across all of the tabloids, across all of the news channels. Her death, according to the agency report from Wales News, would form the basis for all of the other stories, which will bring us to the belief of the link between the suicides and a so-called internet suicide cult. Now, the backstory on Natasha is that for 14 years she has lived in a place that I can't pronounce, so I'm just going to put it on the screen and save us all some pain. Her mom and dad were estranged. I don't really know what that meant at the time, but from the time she was 4, the 2 of them seem not to be having any sort of connection. And Natasha and her sister were actually brought up by their grandma, who seemed to be the person who was the rock of the whole family. A few months before January of 2008 and before Natasha took her life, her grandpa died. So she actually moved to another place that I can't pronounce in Wales with her dad. And her sister seems to have gotten her own flat, and she was kind of spending less and less time with the rest of the family. And not just that, but we don't have further details here, but it is said that the sister might have actually fell in with the wrong crowd. So you can see how, this whole move after you live somewhere for 14 years, the instability within a family, the grandparents' death, and then finally even your sister then on top of that gets in with the wrong crowd, how everything can really trigger somebody who is a young adult, who might be vulnerable. Everything here seems to have been leading to possibly some sort of mental health issues when it came to Natasha. From her friends, however, you will hear that she had a bright future ahead. Her friend described her as somebody who was always polite, always friendly, so it came as a shock what she had done, because they knew that she always had high hopes for the future. When they were 6 years old, they talked about what they wanted to be. They wanted to be pop stars. And they dreamt all sorts of fantasy dreams. Apparently, during those talks, Tasha said that she wanted to be a solicitor. So nobody really knew why somebody with these aspirations would just decide out of a sudden to kill themselves. Another friend gives us a bit more of an insight on the last few years of Tasha's life. She said that they went to the same Welsh comprehensive school, they were really good friends until they were 15. But then they saw each other every day during that time, and suddenly something changed. Once they graduated at 16, they stopped seeing Tasha because she moved to live in with her dad. But she kind of never wanted to do that. She never wanted to move in with her dad. I suppose this might have been around the same time that, her grandparent has passed away. So she never slept there. She started going out and just moving within the druggy scene herself. They all used to smoke cannabis in school, so even, during early teenage years, but this friend said that once she moved, she kind of went for like more serious drugs. And then from the news articles, we hear about the scene, about how Natasha has been found. So these articles are from January the 23rd, 2008. We find out that she was found hanging at her home, that she was the only woman so far in this chain of suicides, and that they have taken her computer to investigate, to see whether something or somebody might have caused this to happen. With her computer in hand, the police will find what they will believe links everything finally for them together, because up until this point nobody really could explain it. However, with Natasha's computer, they could see her logins, right? They could see that she would log in to Bebo, the social network that was prevalent at the time, and that she would post and interact with other posts of the other young adults that were known and would then eventually be linked to the Bridgend suicides. Another thing that the police had uncovered would be an array of what they called memorial sites, like remembrance websites, so this is apart from Bebo, where they found out that a lot of these victims knew one another. Well, on these remembrance sites, they would also find out that, Natasha would post and commemorate somebody else that she knew from school, and then once she died by suicide, the same happened with her. People would post RIP Chick, Sleep Tight Princess, and Sweet Dreams Angel. So this is when the police started linking all of these deaths together, calling it a craze, thinking that this is some sort of a fad, because what if all of these copycat suicides, their words, not mine, mean that all of these teenagers were inspired by these posts, believing that it was cool, that it's cool to have an internet memorial site, and that dying by suicides themselves would achieve that kind of hero worship that they would see because of these exchanges among their own pals, among their own friendship group. At this point, and I would love if somebody had lived through this story and how it was unraveled in the papers, just to confirm everything that I've read online. But this is when in the media everybody honed in on it. This is when you would see the largest amount of articles starting to be published between January and the summer of this year, really. And that is because the momentum has finally been reached. There was finally an angle here. You will hear about the titles calling this the case of an internet death cult, the cyber suicide ring, and the discovery of Bebo and social networking sites being used was in a way giving the public somebody to blame. As we will learn, this wasn't true, and if you think about it, they took Natasha's laptop, and this is going to happen in every single story in this case. They would take their laptop, they would check their social media records, and if it was in anybody's interest to actually calm the public down and prevent any form of suicides happening ever again, it would then be in police's best interest to do so. It would be for them to make a public conference to say, actually, something sinister is going on here in terms of somebody's telling these children to commit these acts. On this channel, I've actually covered a case, I forgot the guy's names now, it's called Suicide Voyeur Nurse. And that is exactly what I have just described. The guy that was online encouraging people to die by suicides themselves. And luckily, he was discovered once he had done considerable amount of damage. But even though that wasn't the case here, the story was already bigger than that. It developed a momentum all on its own, and the news already arrived from all of the different European countries and also from the US. Editorials starting being published. And something that we will talk about in part 2 is just what sections of newspapers cover this story. It was the headline, it was the front page news for the longest time, for most of the tabloids, but then, you had opinion pages, you had editorials, you had it covered in health sections, in financial sector, literally any angle that could have been exploited when it comes to this story would be taken. Here I ask you, and this is truly a $1,000,000 question, why do you think Natasha's story blew out of proportion? Because as I mentioned, this was the 13th suicide that they managed to then link with all of the others within a past year. So why only now? What made it so different? Natasha was a girl, and nobody at that point expected women or young adult women to die by suicide by a method of hanging, which is how Natasha had been found. And there are suicidologists or suicide specialists that look at these cases and looked at how women compare suicide compared to men. And you can probably think of certain ways when it comes to like overdose, or rather using pills, choosing less painful methods, or cutting the wrist, something that will be quick and as painless as possible. And suicidologists say that also women or young adult women are more prone to do it first as a cry for help rather than actually go through with it. And this is actually known as parasuicide, meaning deliberate self-harm without real suicide intent. But what is introduced into the narrative after you actually consider these articles is that when men are dying, public just doesn't seem to be bothered. And as we know from statistics, actually more men die by suicide compared to women. But the public again just doesn't make it a story until a woman suddenly dies by suicide in such a violent manner.
When it was mainly young men dying, the public didn't seem to be that bothered. It's only when you get young females dying by the perceived more sort of gruesome methods that the public starts to be interested and starts to ask, well, why is this happening? What's going on?
As we move on to the second death that the book analyzes in detail, the death of a girl named Angie, that only happened 5 days after Natasha's funeral, I just want you to have something in the back of your minds. Because as much as I do these deep dives, as much as I try to dig for the information on the internet, with some of them you can really say that you don't really know who these people are. Even with the details that I could dig, from the articles that I'm actually posting that I found have been published on the time that somebody, scanned and now are PDFs somewhere in the corners of the internet. And that is something to bear in mind, because if we don't have the details, if we don't have the backstories now, and they definitely didn't have them then, they only just had limited information in order to write up a small article in the papers, in the section, in the column that they wanted to, well then, how are we to make all of those decisions? What is our basis to actually having all of this information to make certain decisions that will be made on this case? When it comes to who is to blame, when it comes to why did this happen, just anything really that had to do with the why of this story. So that brings us to the death by suicide of a girl named Angie that happened on 4th of February. So this would be a little more than a week later after Natasha's suicide. Angie was 18 and she was a young woman who had some history of self-harm. She was also found hanging. Angie also moved to the area that I cannot pronounce from Shropshire about 18 months before she was found. And she moved in to live with her fiancé, who will actually be the person to find her hanging. With Angie's death, you see the immediate switch in tone. In the first couple of articles, she was described as a goth who worked at a designer outlet store and who would write on her social media pages on either Facebook or MySpace that she doesn't like herself, but who does? She continued that post by saying, "I'm an angry drunk, I hate religion, I love my boyfriend, and I had all my hair cut short and dyed purple yesterday." From those initial articles, we'll also find out that she had been on her computer an hour before taking her own life. As I mentioned, her fiancé would actually be the person to find her, and she had died by suicide after they have just thrown a party. So they were just decorating their home, and then a couple of people joined them in to drink, and others have gone to bed. However, Angie decided to carry on partying downstairs. Once her fiancé found her, he will post this on MySpace to inform the public that Angie had died. Just a note to let you all know that at 1 a.m. Monday morning, life took away from us one of the kindest, sweet-hearted, loving people we could have ever been blessed to know. I love Angie and I always will. I love you, baby. Once the police has actually looked into this case, we find a bit more information. We find a backstory, if you wish. So Angie was actually of Indian descent. Well, her parents were Indian. She worked at a Jaeger fashion chain at a designer outlet that was close to Bridgend. And she was living in with her boyfriend at the time. So there would be a couple of people that spoke up after Angie died by suicide, saying that yes, they loved one another, there was this whole side to it, but that even though they got engaged and were now living together, that the relationship was kind of rocky at times. This person that left that comment also, however, said that they would always work it out. They got engaged, so there was something for Angie to look forward to. And this is something that you will again hear on repeat when it comes to every story. That maybe, yes, where they were working right now kind of was fitting with where Bridgend was, in terms of working class. They maybe didn't have the best of careers, etc., but that they were aspiring to move to do something better or to get married. They had something to live for. Once Angie was found, the paramedics were called. They were unable to revive her because there had already been a couple of hours before her fiance would find her. And then she would go to the coroner's, and the pathologist findings found out during the post-mortem examination that there was no physical evidence of any third-party involvement. And then when looking at the social media, they obviously attributed this to the rest of the chain of the Bridgend suicides. Toxicology tests also confirmed that her blood alcohol level was 164 milligrams per 100 milliliter of blood, meaning twice the drink drive limit. And the final cause of death was yet to be confirmed at the time, and then they managed to confirm that she did indeed hang herself. Let us briefly speak about really the most unspoken, probably, area of this case, and that is the coroners. And once these bodies would actually be moved to be examined for people to determine the cause of death, because beyond the media, this is how the public would really hone in. Because the coroner started saying that suddenly there was increased amount of bodies that they would get to examine. And this is a bit wild, but for a death to be ruled a suicide in the UK, the coroner must have concrete evidence that the person intended to kill themselves. Meaning that they must show intent. And how the hell do you show intent? So this would further result in the coroners determining the cause of death would be hanging, but then only classifying certain cases as actual suicides, quote unquote. And the writer of the book actually says that this just further stirred, the issues when it comes to reporting, when it comes to the families, because what do you mean? when you call it self-murder, this non-suicides kind of muddles the definition of what actually occurred. And it muddles it for the family left behind and also for the press that reports on it.
From the time of putting a noose around your neck, you are clearly putting yourself in considerable danger. Consciousness can be lost very quickly. It might be 3 or 4 seconds. The tissues of the upper throat can be actually pulled up into the back of your mouth, into what's called the pharynx, and block the airway. Now, that probably is what happens as a terminal event in many of the cases when consciousness is lost and their full weight goes into the noose, because then the tissues of the neck are drawn up and the airway is obstructed.
When did you realize that something unusual was going on with the number of hangings in Bridgend?
We did notice in 2007 that we had a very surprising increase in the number of young suicides in particular over what we normally see. We do get suicides every year, but the numbers that we were getting were far above what we would normally expect to see.
The coroners would further lead to stigmatization as if that wasn't enough, classifying it as an actual suicide rather than not that, by saying that this would be a masculine-oriented technique. That usually, again, with Angie, with Natasha, why, these reports would actually make it to the public, is that usually these types of suicides by hanging are linked to high emotional pain. The suicidologists would say when the women do it, there seems to have been a group norm effect, meaning they do it because their friends might have done it. And there's also the fact that further away from home one does it, the more delayed the discovery, meaning there is always some sort of revenge involved, if you wish. So revenge against parents, against partners, whoever they perceive to have caused them pain. One coroner in particular that is mentioned in plenty of these articles, called Philip Walters, kind of alludes to that whole idea that we already spoke about, where it happens more frequently with men, of how women choose the more painless methods, saying that he's not convinced that some of those who died actually realized how quickly it happens, that they would be dead in 1 or 2 seconds, maybe even less. And obviously here that delay of discovery plays a huge factor, because you have to think whether or not there was any thought process on the day when they have decided to die by suicide that had some sort of delay of discovery in consideration. Because a lot of them would just happen outside in the middle of nowhere, and then there would be the few that we are mentioning that happened actually in the house. However, they happened during unsocial hours when people knew others would be sleeping and wouldn't be able to find them, ensuring that they would be found dead. I know how morbid this is. But by this point, there was a debate online and coroners were involved because everybody wanted an explanation. Who better to actually explain what is really happening but pathologists and coroners, people examining these dead young people. So the debate followed 14 suspected suicides among people under 26 and in and around Bridgend over the past year. So this is when in February of 2008 an article was published by a coroner saying that the suicides have not been linked. The coroner, Philip Walters, that we keep mentioning, actually at the inquest into the death of Angie's, said that he is of the mind that there is no commonality between these deaths. However, he still called for a national strategy to deal with the problem, and this is how they adjourned that inquest for more investigations. So they weren't giving up on it, they were just telling people that at least physically nobody was behind those suicides. That, when delivered to the media outlets and then through the media outlets to the public, obviously still doesn't discard the social media, doesn't discard the internet, doesn't discard that as the commonality between those suicides. Just 10 days after that statement had been made by the coroner about the suicides not being linked, Jenna, who was a 16-year-old, would also be found hanging from a tree in the wooded area that was called the Snake Pit. This would be half a mile away from her home, meaning that also there was delay in finding her. People who went to the same school with Jenna describe her as somebody who was always happy and bubbly, a lovely person, that nobody really could explain why. But this would have been a month after Natasha's suicide, and maybe she did it because of Tasha, because they knew each other. Maybe she did it because she split up with her boyfriend just a day or so before, and they have apparently been together for a long time. Jenna, like so many people in this story, also had a history of trying to die by suicide twice before, in her case. The mom of her best friend actually said that the night before Jenna was to die by suicide, she saw her. She saw her at about 7 p.m. and Jenna just seemed to be laughing and giggling without a single care in the world. Jenna was really a catalyst when it comes to Bridgend's suicide story, because the parents and the public through the media also started honing in on the fact that either people who were dying by suicide that were attributed to this cluster were all young people who either knew each other or were really good friends with somebody whose cousin, in Jenna's case, for example, also died by suicide, whether it is only a few weeks or a few months ago. So this would have definitely affected them. But at this point also the parents weren't taking the shit, because the narrative was still that Bebo, that other social media websites, MySpace, all the pages commemorating everything were to be at fault. However, this is when the articles started coming out from the parents, saying that the media reporting is what has made this case unbearable, that they feel the coverage put an idea into their child's heads and the glamorizing ways of taking their own life. The mom of another victim has actually said that they never believed there was an internet pact, and it certainly had nothing to do with living in Bridgend, because it was a nice place to live. What followed from these articles is then the chief constable, called David Morris, also saying in public that a number of suicides he accepted had access to social networking sites, but there was no suggestion that anybody used these sites as a means to take their lives. Young people tell the police that the media coverage is starting to contribute to those pressures.
We will look at all means of communication, and we acknowledge that young people communicate by text, by mobile telephone, and of course make full use of the internet, email and such networking sites.
He said there is an array of factors here for the influence. He said there is an array of factors here influencing young people taking their own lives, but that they, young people, tell the police that the media coverage is starting to contribute to those pressures. As you could imagine, the media publications wouldn't really react well to this, and they would obviously, side with the parents and would report their quotes. However, in these articles, when they would publish the words of the police officers in the press conferences, well, they would say, well, that is just not really proven, because the suicides happened first, and then the media started reporting. Which, let's not play the chicken and the egg theory here. True, in probably the first couple of cases, maybe. But then, the media is probably a factor, to at least some degree, because as I have just walked you through, they really ignored the deaths of anybody who was a young male all the way up until Natasha's death, and then the story really blew out of proportion. So, correct to a certain degree, I'm trying to give you the most unbiased account of events, but then also we have to see the other side here. Jenna's death in the context of this story also sparks up a wholly different conversation. The one that I have already started saying is controversial, the one about intent. Because in October, it will be determined that there was no link between Jenna's suicide and other Bridgend suicides. The article would say that since January 2007, 23 young people in or from Bridgend County were thought to have killed themselves, but the police ruled out connection between these and Jenna's death. And our infamous coroner here, Philip Walters, said that he was not satisfied that Jenna committed suicide. So he recorded a narrative verdict that she killed herself unintentionally with a noose. He said there's no evidence that this is what she intended to do, and this is the outcome of what she has done. And then the pathologist said the death would have been quick. I don't understand this. If somebody does, if you are a pathologist, a coroner, can tell me, how do you explain to somebody in simple English how somebody can unintentionally kill themselves with a noose? I don't know, it just doesn't make any sense to me. The thing that we are basing this off of the intent, and how do we establish intent? Like, is it in the medical books? Is that where I lack the knowledge on? Because that makes zero sense to me. Because where I thought this article would lead is them establishing that there was no connection on social media, for example, and that Jenna didn't know anybody. But that isn't how they ruled this out. So, going back in time of Jenna's death, something really had to be done with the posts and with the social media accounts, rather really with memorial pages. The police by this point had the knowledge that internet might have been a crossover, that Bebo in particular might have actually sparked some suicides because of all of the memorial posts dedicated to the suicide victims. So the memorial pages that highlighted that some of the people that died by suicide in this case had more than 3,000 friends, more than they would have ever had in real life, had to be taken down. Police would justify this, saying that there was never any evidence of criminal activity, and by this point they have examined 20 plus cases. So that this only can lead to the conclusion that some people already might have had suicidal thoughts, might have had certain mental health conditions that weren't really treated, and then these posts just provided a spark. It is as if they gave them the permission to finally do it.
The theory that makes sense in the absence of any other evidence is one of suicide contagion. And that's where we have a death in a community, and it's as if it gives permission to others that they may now take their lives. We're not saying that you can put some suicide into somebody's head, because you can't. What we're saying is that there are people in the community who are already vulnerable, already experiencing suicidal thoughts, but this death that occurs can give them permission to actually to go ahead with the act of taking their lives.
The basis for the government to actually close the website down, because as you can imagine, that probably had to go through like 10 different people just for that decision to be made, was that it was believed that 17 deaths in just 13 months were linked via social networking websites, like MySpace and Bebo. The police would have eventually ruled that out, but at that point that was enough for those websites to be shut down. Now, going back to Jenna's death, actually only a few days before her death, there was one suicide, rather one pair of suicides that was only reported as a death by suicide of two people. And that is because these two individuals were cousins. So this happened on February the 16th. Nathaniel, who was 15 years old, had been in a relationship with a girl for about 8 months. However, the relationship seemed to have been rocky, and actually in the early evening, he had a conversation with his now ex on his computer. He was using MSN, and she told him she started seeing somebody else. So he responded, "I'm going to kill myself, and it will be your fault." Nathaniel was the 16th and the youngest victim of the Bridgend suicide cluster, and he will be found hanging in his home, and it would be his 9-year-old brother that would find him hanging the next morning. Once his brother found Nathaniel, he would call his parents, and then they would basically take him down, transport him to the hospital, and put him on the life support machine. However, hours later, he would die. And following that, his cousin called Kelly would be found dead inside of a bathroom at this holiday house in Kent only hours after she would find out that her cousin had hung himself. An inquest would have to be made in every single one of these cases, but they already suspected that there were just no suspicious circumstances. And it is confirmed in the articles that I have read, and I think that that is a prevalent factor, that Kelly learned, whether it was through social media, whether somebody called her, and that her suicide was actually directly sparked by her cousins. Because she apparently, while at this holiday house in Kent, told the relative that she was staying with that she's just gonna go to the bathroom, but then she kind of failed to get out of the bathroom, and then they went to investigate and found her dead. When they looked at their social media pages, even the coroners requested the printouts of like the MSN messages. That's why we have them between Nathaniel and his girlfriend. When it comes to Kelly, they found out a different picture, that she was just again full of life. She would post, "I just love to live life to the full. Always up for a laugh and don't like taking things too serious. Alcohol is one of my favorite things. I love to go out and get drunk and have a laugh with mates." The pictures that were later found out at the inquest also shown that Kelly had known Natasha as well, and two other Bridgend suicide victims. One of her internet friends said that it's going crazy down in Bridgend and it's not going to stop. No one can understand what is going on. I know 7 of the people who have killed themselves. People are saying it's got something to do with the internet, but I don't believe that. But then I can't explain it either. I saw Kelly a month ago and she was fine, smiling and laughing. You will find very similar reports, just like with other victims in this case, where nobody expected it. It was always that sense of them having great future ahead of them, even though maybe they're not in the best position right now, and maybe because of that, they have resorted to alcohol or have tried to die by suicide before. However, they were always smiling, laughing the day before, the night before. And here with Kelly, I have to point out a couple of things. And again, a couple of things that you will be seeing through this story. First thing being, check up with your friends. Even if they appear to be having a blast, having the best time ever, posting on Instagram the best parts of their life every single day of the goddamn year, and if they seem to be laughing and having a blast, just check in if they're actually happy on the inside. But also with Kelly, I don't know if I mentioned her age. Kelly was actually 20. And something that you notice, especially when it comes to the reporting of this particular suicide cluster, rather pair, that we will analyze in part 2, is that it only comes as a pair. And even here, and even with Jenna and Natasha before, they will try to infantilize women, try to re-victimize them again and again by just how flabbergasted everybody was of the method they chose to die by suicide with, and also always refer to them as girls. Another girl died by suicide. And in most cases, I can't remember on the top of my head, but Anne mentions it in her book, either women dying in these cases would be of legal age, so like 18 plus, or they would be young adults. And you have to think again, have it in the back of your head, what does that mean when you read another girl? Another girl who has read a social media post and then decided hours later to commit suicide herself. What does that mean for you as a public when you consume that type of news constantly? Does it mean that you form a certain opinion of who this person really was and why did they choose to do it? And something that strikes me with Kelly's story is that she was out of Bridgend at the time. So what would have been the factors here in your opinion? Because maybe she found it out through social media, maybe it was through a phone call, and it had immediate effect on her because she was in Kent, she wasn't even in Bridgend at the time. By the end of February, you will read articles about the anti-suicide squad patrolling the street. Samaritans actually going out physically, all of these counselors just speaking up with the people, just offering advice. To me, from the distance, both in time and space, it just seemed like the stage of sheer panic. parents were given advice by papyrus and also by the Samaritans on how to speak with the children, how to be able to offer them any support. But despite these tips, or rather you can see this from a different angle, that maybe there was sort of some reactive reaction to the Bridgend suicides rather than proactive, because this next case really makes your blood boil and there's not much information. But there was a suicide that had happened around February, around the cases that we have just spoken about, of a guy called Anthony, who was 19 years old at the time and who still died by suicide before the media frenzy got underway. This story would only be uncovered here, but it was said that this was actually the fifth suicide that they managed to link to the Bridgend suicides. And the family here was fuming, because this case really shows you everything that people are trying to just brush off, hide, shove under the carpet, just not really talk. And the reason why is because it shows the massive failings just in this case, and then you have to wonder in how many other cases that maybe should have been an angle that somebody should have looked into. Anthony had a history of self-harming, just like other Bridgend suicide victims. And he actually went to casualty, so I assume that is accidents and emergencies, twice, and both times he was actually sent home. So his mom actually showed these reporters the letter, where they described Anthony and why they sent him home as a drain on the resources that was in place because of the high risk and complexity, that the issues that he had did not fit the mold of present risk information. So even though he represented high risk and complexity, this case did not fit the mold of the present resource provision. And his mom, rightfully so, said, "How dare you say that he is a drain on resources? How dare you say that about my own flesh and blood?" This case really showcased how the judgment of the health trust at that time was that Anthony's illness was just too hard, too difficult to treat, so they didn't. Instead, Anthony would just be yet another person that would be connected to Bridgend suicides. But here really, this could have been prevented. And that's why I'm saying you have to wonder why not proactively then start thinking about putting counselors on streets, putting something in place in schools, for example. If you know all of them are linked to like a specific school, which I think from, if I remember right, there's only a few comprehensive schools in Wales, only 3 if I remember, which facilitates you. Then just put counselors in there to speak with these people. If you think it's social media, again, sort of try to tackle that as an issue. But rather what you see here, and what we are going to speak about now, is that all of these come reactively after the suicides have happened, after over 20 people have died by suicide. Which leads me to the suicide prevention strategy, further on to, the counselors being on the streets, and this is what I find to be a political move of sorts. The mass coverage that was blamed for so many suicides in this case possibly could have actually inspired some political maneuvering. There were already some steps underway, but as the direct results of these deaths, the Welsh Assembly also officially formulated a suicide prevention strategy. And whether or not this has actually worked, or again, you can let me know what you think might have been the reason, but the suicide count started dwindling down in the following months. So April, May, and June, you really only see reports of a couple of suicides. There's not even that much of a link made, and again, it is both males and females. And in my personal opinion, that is because the journalists were out of angles. And I'm saying that as somebody who has graduated in journalism, by the way, because this story truly is just such a shame on like so many ethical principles that you are taught as a journalist. But what else? How else can you sensationalize a story? And then if it's not front page news, I cannot believe how many like really small columns have been attributed here, that some of them I'm posting on the screen as we go along. Some of them are just insane. It's like Spice Girls, or I don't even know who, like, and how their conversation was made public about this Swiss. It's just so ridiculous, like how hard they try to exploit every single possible angle. In like the columns, they don't make sense. I have been going through this, and I mean 2007 to 2009 is really truly like the best time to have been alive for fashion sense and ridiculousness of it all, and also the music. But you know, when you read about this story and there's like a paragraph on it, and then below it it's like, oh, what is Zac Efron looking for in a girl? And there is a huger chunk on that topic, and you just start wondering why. Why not just stop then reporting of it all together? The last suicide the book focuses on, and so are we, happened in April. At this point, suicide count already hit 19. And this will be the suicide of a 19-year-old Sean Rees, who hung himself on the top site. This was the area that was just behind one of the clubs that was known. In the articles, it was said that he was discovered at 7:30 a.m. and that his parents and two other siblings are also just being comforted at home. He would be discovered by his dad and his brother, who had just gone out to look for Sean because he didn't return after storming off after some sort of argument that he had had with his friends on a night out. You see the similar reporting when it came to Sean, that people just couldn't work out why this had happened, that he had everything to live for and that he was always a cheerful person to be around. He just also passed his driving test, had a decent job, he worked at Sainsbury's and was popular among his friend group. I haven't seen anywhere the details of that row, of that argument published, but it was said that he went out for a drink with a couple of friends on a Saturday night, and then he was found dead by Sunday morning. It was never attributed to anything else but this suicide cluster. I'm not trying to blame this onto somebody. But after Sean's death, as you could imagine, the suicides also just started dwindling out, without any real explanation. There were a few in August, then some in November, and one in December. And something that was noticed, and I kept repeating throughout this story, but was always neglected, it was always on the back burner, and that was the connection between these individuals. It would always be mentioned sort of just briefly in one of the paragraphs, how this person was connected to the other victims because they either lived together, or they went to the same school, or they were actually in the same friendship group. But nobody was really exploring that area at all. So at this point there were no official figures, but an area that would normally see 2 or 3 suicides of young people a year ended up seeing an estimated 25 in 2 years' time. All of them died by hanging. So let's speak briefly about where this case is now, and then sort of explore the question that I have started this video with. Was there ever a basis for seeing this as some form of cult that was inspired online by the messages from the other victims of Bridgend suicides? So between 1996 and 2006, an average of 3 men ended taking their own lives in Bridgend every year, which would have been a significant drop. And then in 2007, the total was believed to be at 9. 2010, the reports came through that another 2 people died by suicide in the town, so it means that suicide has been on the decrease ever since. In 2010, police asked the media to stop covering the suicides in an attempt to prevent any copycat cases. In 2013, a documentary came out about Bridgend, and then in 2015, I think this was a fictional drama film that came out. Both were called Bridgend. The 2015 one has like really shitty reviews on IMDb. Let me know if you watched any of them. I watched something, which was literally just like a vox pop. It was like interviews with different families and stuff. I can link that below, but I haven't watched any of those two. The 2015 one was viewed as sensationalist, that it just lacked truth, that it was just fictional, which I find to be happening more and more often. And really the only precedent that I would say that I would like to see more of would be The Dropout, in terms of like how they ruined representation of Elizabeth Holmes. That if you are going to represent crimes, represent them that way. But here I cannot imagine how you would actually portray Bridgend suicides unless you're just narrating a story. I just can't picture it, so I'm not going to invest my time in watching those. So after that, this book by Anne was published in 2016, but after that nobody really spoke about the damage that had been done here. So at this point, when you have heard the timeline of events, you know the story, do you think there's any evidence of the media being right and the cult killing off the people here? According to The Atlantic, there are 7 main factors that should make you sort of see the red flags and think that you are in a cult, including opposing critical thinking, isolating members, penalizing them for all sorts of things, emphasizing different doctrines, then seeking inappropriate loyalty, dishonoring the family unit, and then if it's religion, it's also like separation from church and crossing biblical boundaries. But now you're probably saying, Maya, this clearly wouldn't have been just any cult. It isn't Jonestown. It isn't people dying all together somewhere in the field. It isn't like that. It is an internet cult, or at least that is what it was referred as. Well, even if it transfers to the online world, still a great devotion to a person or an idea is needed, as well as people united by devotion or allegiance to something, somebody, intellectual movement, or a figure. And here that just hasn't been proven. There was no charismatic leader that somebody had to worship, or all of these victims had to worship. There was no process of indoctrination, there was no education, there were no scriptures, outside of whatever was regular, even if it came to like schooling or anything like that. And there was no economic, sexual, or any other exploitation by group members, by the leader, or the movement, or whatever we are saying that this was. There was zilch of evidence of this ever being a cult. Yes, people would publishing online, saying their rest in peace messages, saying that they might meet that person in another life, saying that they hope they rest easy, that they have died easily and beautifully, which does apply to possibly other versions of the cults, but also it does apply to every form of death that is then distributed online and how people react to it. But then there are exemptions. Kelly's case, she wasn't even in Bridgend. She might have been personally affected, yes, but she wasn't even in that area. All of the cases where, as controversially as it is, the intent couldn't be proven. There were cases of people who weren't even computer literate. So how are we attributing them to the cult? And on top of that, if you remember earlier, we spoke about how 12 suicides happened before the story even broke it really in the media. Meaning those 12 people then somehow had to find ways to communicate among each other, or had to be all that well connected, had to inspire these copycat murders somehow, for this to ever have basis to be considered a cult. You have to wonder about how all of these things fit, or rather don't fit, into the story. And about journalists and how they have actually committed to their roles. How they have had to look for the reasons, for the explanations, for the basis of something like this suddenly happening throughout the space of the year, in order to then reinstall normalcy as soon as possible. And the easiest way to do this, according to the book, is to talk about the suicides, and those who attempt and complete the act in a way that is understandable to all, and also then provides a warning to those who might contemplate it. That way would be infantilizing adults, describing the act of suicide as something a child might do, and also articulating the issue further by assigning adult suicide to the category of deviant child, meaning there was some form of othering that had happened in this case when it came to Bridgend and when it came to the case of Bridgend suicides. However, some of you might say someone was heavily exploiting the story, meaning there was an economic value attached to it, or that there was brainwashing involved through coercive persuasion on social media websites. The parents and the general public won't be able to drop it. So can Bridgend suicides be attributed to the media and how the newspapers decided to share this story? This is where we will pick up in part 2. And now let us all have a deep breath. Inhale and exhale. And now go and watch the stupidest video in the internet. Just go and watch something that will make you insanely happy. I don't know, Crazy Frog. Go watch Crazy Frog. Go watch an episode of Gossip Girl. I don't know. Something that will bring your mood right the fuck up. Because this story is taking a toll on my mental health, and I have only been researching it for a week. I say that, but it has taken over my life. This research takes over my life. So, if you are also into exploring the topics that other people don't and questioning why they were presented to the public the way that they were, make sure you share this type of content that you like and subscribe. And I have zero energy left in me because this is such a depressing story. So I'm going to edit this part, make sure that I put it out on like Saturday or Sunday, and then record the second one tomorrow so that you don't have to wait for a long time, and I can put it then out next week. Hopefully, fingers crossed, yay. The next one is gonna be long because we are going into a deep dive, and as I mentioned, it's going to be different because it's kind of taking a journalistic angle to it, so you're gonna learn a lot about the percentages and coverage in the media and all of that good stuff that isn't fun at all. That is not fun at all, but we have to speak about it because, in my opinion, somebody should have been blamed here, penalized in some sort of way. You let me know if you share the same opinion, but this is just, you know, just even the snapshots of the articles and the headlines that I have been posting on the screen. That is not how you publicate a story. That is not how you publish this type of story. You don't just blame it on a non-existent cult. You just don't, without any basis. So you let me know what your opinions are so far on this story, and I shall be seeing you very shortly. I need a beverage, and I need, I don't know, a bath, a cleanse, physical and mental, and you should follow my lead. So you sound culty now. You sound fucking culty. Stop it. Stop.